Picture the most prosperous civilization on the surface of the planet. Not in some vague romantic sense, but in the hard, accountable language of economic output. Around the year 1700, the Indian subcontinent produced roughly 1/4 of everything the entire world made. 1 in every 4 goods manufactured on this earth, 1 in every 4 textiles woven, 1 in every 4 ships loaded with finished products for foreign markets came from the cities and workshops and fields of India. Its weavers in Dhaka produced cloth so fine that British merchants called it woven air. Its steelmakers in the Deccan Plateau had mastered techniques that European metallurgists could not replicate. Its merchants moved money across Asia through a credit network, so sophisticated it required no gold to travel at all. This was not a primitive civilization waiting to be rescued by a more advanced one. This was an economic giant, the largest on Earth, operating at a level of sophistication that the Europe of its era was still learning to approach. Now hold that image. Hold the number, 1/4 of the world, and then consider what the same land produced in 1947, the year the British finally departed after almost 2 centuries of rule. India's share of global economic output had fallen to approximately 3 to 4%, not simply because the rest of the world had grown around it, but in the devastated, hollowed-out terms of a civilization that had been systematically dismantled and redirected to serve a purpose other than its own prosperity. And yet the story most of us have been told, the story repeated in British textbooks and Commonwealth speeches, and the casual assumptions of educated people on every continent, is almost precisely the reverse. The story goes like this. Britain arrived in India and found fragmented, warring kingdoms. It imposed order, built railways and roads and telegraph lines, introduced rule of law and a modern administrative structure, educated an elite class that would go on to lead the independent nation. And while the relationship was not without its difficulties, on balance, Britain developed India. The British Empire was, whatever its imperfections, a civilizing project. It gave more than it took. That is the story. And today we are going to do something that most people who repeat that story never bother to do. We are going to open the actual accounts. We are going to follow the money the same way you follow it in a fraud investigation, tracing where it went in and where it came out, sitting with the mechanisms rather than the intentions. Because in matters of empire, what the men at the top believed they were doing matters far less than what their system actually did. And what the system actually did was extract, at a scale so vast and through instruments so precisely engineered, that the most careful economic analysis of the last century put a number on it that most people, when they hear it for the first time, assume must be an error. $45 trillion. That is the figure produced by the Indian economist Utsa Patnaik, published by Columbia University Press in 2018, compiled from 2 centuries of trade and fiscal data. $45 trillion moved from India to Britain between 1765 and 1938. A number so large it exceeds the combined GDP of every country on Earth today. And Patnaik is not a polemicist or a pamphleteer. She is a rigorous academic working from documented records, using methodology that earns peer review rather than headlines. We will come back to her and to exactly how she arrived at that figure, because the method matters as much as the conclusion. But first, we need to understand the machinery that made the extraction possible. And to understand the machinery, we need to go back to the precise afternoon it was assembled. It was built on a muddy plain beside a river called the Bhagirathi in the summer of 1757, in a province of Bengal that had, until that day, been one of the wealthiest regions on Earth. The Battle of Plassey is one of the strangest military engagements in the history of conquest, because it was barely a battle at all. Robert Clive, a former bookkeeper's clerk turned East India Company officer, faced an army of perhaps 50,000 men under the Nawab of Bengal, Siraj-ud-Dowlah, with a force of roughly 3,000 soldiers, a mix of company troops and Indian sepoys. By any conventional military calculation, the outcome should not have been in question. But Clive had done something that changed the arithmetic entirely. He had bribed the Nawab's own commander-in-chief, Mir Jafar, to betray his master on the day of the engagement. When the guns began firing, Mir Jafar held his vast force back from the field. The Nawab's army, confused and abandoned, crumbled. By the afternoon, the battle was effectively over without having properly started. Siraj-ud-Dowlah fled, was captured, and was killed within days. Mir Jafar was installed as the new Nawab of Bengal, a puppet whose strings would be pulled from the company's offices in Calcutta. What followed in the weeks after Plassey was not governance, it was a looting. Clive and his officers walked into the treasury of Bengal and helped themselves to cash and bullion worth, by modern estimates, somewhere between £200 and £300 million in today's money. Clive personally extracted a fortune equivalent to tens of millions of pounds, and later described this to a British parliamentary committee with a candor that should have shamed him, but apparently did not. He told the inquiry, in so many words, that he was astonished at his own moderation. That was the word he used: moderation. He had been standing in front of one of the greatest treasuries in Asia, and he had only taken a portion of it, and he found this admirable restraint worthy of mention to Parliament. But the real significance of Plassey was not the looting of a single treasury, as spectacular as that looting was. It was what the victory made possible going forward. The system Clive's conquest licensed, because once the East India Company controlled Bengal, it controlled Bengal's revenue, and the company immediately began doing something that no colonial power had done before, not in quite this form, not with this particular precision. It began taxing Bengal's peasants, artisans, and merchants, collecting the revenues of the province, and then using a portion of those very revenues to purchase Bengal's own goods for export to Britain. Think carefully about what that means. The company was not bringing British capital to India to purchase Indian products. It was taking India's own money, using it to buy India's own goods, and shipping those goods to Britain to be sold at profit. The sterling that left the province in the form of purchased exports had never originated in Britain. It had come from the province itself, extracted as tax revenue and then recycled through the fiction of commerce. Bengal was, in effect, selling its own wealth to itself and receiving nothing in return except the privilege of being administered by the people running the scheme. This is the mechanism that Dadabhai Naoroji identified and named in 1876, almost a century before Patnaik would quantify it fully. Naoroji was a Parsi merchant, educator, and eventually the first Asian member of the British Parliament, a man of extraordinary intellectual precision who spent decades working through trade statistics and fiscal records. He called what he found the drain, and he wrote about it in a book called Poverty and Un-British Rule in India, a title calibrated to sting precisely where it would be felt most. What Britain was doing, Naoroji argued, was not British in the sense Britain claimed for itself. It was not just. It was not honest. It was a systematic transfer of wealth from one of the most productive populations on Earth to one of the most powerful governments, dressed up in the language of civilization and administered in the name of progress. The British response to Naoroji's drain theory was to dismiss it, to mock it, and in some cases to simply refuse to engage with the numbers. It was too inconvenient. The narrative of the civilizing mission was too important to the national self-image. A careful accountant showing you the opposite in documented form was not an argument to engage with. It was a threat to be managed. But the drain did not depend on anyone acknowledging it to be real. It operated through mechanisms that, once you understand them, are as legible as the ledger lines they were recorded in. And the most important of those mechanisms, the one that Patnaik's research traced with the greatest precision, was a financial instrument called the Council Bill. Here is how it worked, and it is worth following with care, because the elegance of the mechanism is precisely what made it so effective and so invisible. India, as a major exporter of goods to the world, was constantly earning foreign exchange. Merchants in Britain, France, the United States, and elsewhere needed to purchase Indian cotton, Indian indigo, Indian jute, Indian opium, Indian tea. To pay for those goods, they needed to acquire Indian currency or credit. In a normal, honest system, that currency or credit would have flowed back to India, enriching the country that had done the producing. What the British set up instead was a system in which foreign buyers of Indian goods did not pay Indian exporters directly. They paid the British government in London, purchasing something called a Council Bill, a government-issued voucher redeemable in India for rupees from the government's own treasury. The Indian exporter received his rupees, the foreign buyer received his goods, and the British government in London collected the sterling that India had actually earned. The hard currency that India had generated through its exports never arrived in India. It arrived in Britain. And in India, The government simply created the rupees it handed out by taxing the Indian population to replenish the treasury. The result was a system in which India exported goods worth hundreds of millions of pounds annually and received, as its reward, a higher tax burden. The wealth that should have circulated back into the Indian economy, funding its industries, enriching its workers, building its own financial institutions, was systematically rerouted to Britain before it ever crossed the Indian Ocean. Trade, in other words, was not the mechanism of mutual enrichment it is supposed to be. It was the disguise the drain wore to look like commerce. And then there were the home charges, the drain's second instrument, and in some ways, its most perverse. Home charges were the costs Britain levied on India for the privilege of being governed by Britain. India paid the salaries of British civil servants administering the subcontinent, from the Secretary of State's staff in London down to the district collectors in the provinces. India paid the pensions of those civil servants when they retired and returned to England. India paid the interest on debts Britain had incurred in the process of conquering India. India paid for the British Army's operations on the subcontinent, including not only the defense of India's own frontiers, but the use of Indian troops in British military campaigns in China, Afghanistan, Ethiopia, Sudan, and both world wars. India paid for the British Navy's operations in Indian waters. India even paid for the office furniture in the Secretary of State's London offices. Every one of these payments was denominated in sterling and transferred to Britain. India was financing its own occupation, paying the wages of the men holding it down, and then paying those same men a pension to thank them for the service. It was a tribute system of extraordinary completeness, hidden behind the bureaucratic language of administrative budgeting. Now, this is precisely where the railways enter the story. Because the railways are the crown jewel in the pro-empire case. Britain built more than 40,000 miles of track across the subcontinent, one of the largest railway networks in the world, a feat of engineering that connected distant regions and enabled the movement of goods on a scale never before seen in India's history. And that is technically true in every particular and almost entirely misleading in everything it implies. The railways were not built to develop India. They were not built to connect Indian markets to each other, or to bring prosperity to Indian regions, or to integrate the subcontinent into a coherent economic unit on terms that would benefit Indian people. They were built for two purposes that had nothing to do with Indian development. They were built to move troops rapidly across the subcontinent to suppress rebellion, following the trauma of 1857, when the uprising that the British called the Mutiny revealed how dangerously slow the movement of forces was across Indian distances. And they were built to move raw materials from India's interior to India's ports, where those materials would be shipped to British factories, processed, and sold back to Indians as finished manufactured goods at a profit. The direction of the railway lines tells the story without requiring a word of interpretation. The network was organized around the ports of Bombay, Calcutta, and Madras. Lines radiated inward from those ports like fingers reaching into the interior to gather resources and pull them seaward. Lines connecting inland Indian cities to each other, the kind of infrastructure that would have integrated an Indian national economy, were a secondary and largely afterthought concern. You do not build a development network whose lines point exclusively at the exits. And who paid for those railways? Not Britain, India. The construction of the Indian railway network was financed through guaranteed loans to private British companies, with the guarantee provided by the Indian government, meaning by Indian taxpayers. The companies were guaranteed a return of 5% on their capital, regardless of whether the railways made money. When they did not, which was frequently in the early decades, the Indian treasury made up the shortfall. Indian peasants paid higher taxes so that British shareholders could receive a guaranteed dividend on infrastructure India had built, on land India had provided, for a network that extracted Indian resources. It was extraction engineered into steel rails and labeled development, and the labeling worked remarkably well for over a century. The de-industrialization of India's textile industry is the other piece of the picture that becomes impossible to look away from once you see it plainly. Before the British arrived in force, India was the world's leading exporter of textiles. The weavers of Bengal, Gujarat, and the Coromandel coast supplied cloth to the world at a quality no other country could match at comparable price. The muslin of Dhaka was so fine that Mughal emperors called it woven air, that poets wrote about fabric you could pass through a finger ring, that European buyers paid extraordinary premiums for something the looms of their own continent could not produce. In the early 1700s, Indian textiles accounted for roughly 25% of global textile trade. By 1870, India had been transformed from the world's greatest textile exporter into the world's largest captive market for British textiles. This did not happen because British cloth was superior. British machine-made cloth was cheaper to produce, manufactured in factories powered by coal and driven by capital accumulated in part through colonial extraction. But the transformation was not just about industrial efficiency. It was enforced by a deliberately asymmetric trade regime. In the 18th century, when British industry still needed protection, Britain imposed duties of up to 70% on imported Indian textiles. In the 19th century, once British industry had achieved dominance, India was required to operate under free trade principles, allowing British cloth to enter at low or zero tariffs, while Indian manufacturing faced barriers abroad. The rules changed depending on which direction the trade was flowing and who it was flowing toward. The weavers of Bengal, who had for generations sustained themselves and their families through a craft of extraordinary refinement, found their markets destroyed in a matter of decades. Hundreds of thousands of artisans were pushed from skilled craftwork into impoverished agricultural labor. A Governor-General of India reported to the East India Company's board that the bones of cotton weavers were bleaching the plains of India. The phrase sounds like exaggeration. The poverty it described was documented, and then there were the famines. This is the most devastating section of the accounting, the part that moves from economic analysis into something requiring a harder kind of reckoning. Between 1770 and 1900, India experienced famines at a scale and frequency the subcontinent had not known before the arrival of British administration. The Bengal famine of 1770 killed an estimated 10 million people, roughly a third of Bengal's entire population, in the years immediately following the company's takeover of the province, when the company was extracting maximum revenue while providing nothing for the people generating it. The Great Famine of 1876 to 1879 killed between 6 and 10 million people in southern India. The famine of 1896 to 1897 killed an estimated 5 million more. These were not natural disasters in the way the word natural implies inevitability. They were famines that occurred in regions that were simultaneously exporting food. Grain shipments continued during multiple famine events because the trade obligations of empire did not pause for the inconvenience of mass starvation. The food was present. What the dying lacked was the purchasing power to buy it. Purchasing power that had been extracted in the form of taxes, transferred to London as home charges, and removed from local circulation because the drain had taken it. The historian Mike Davis, in his study of these events, was direct about the conclusion. These were not natural calamities. They were political events, the foreseeable consequences of policies that placed fiscal extraction above human life. The last of the great colonial famines, the Bengal famine of 1943, which killed between 2 and 3 million people, did not occur in the crude early days of the East India Company. It occurred under a modern British administration with full knowledge of what was happening. Winston Churchill's wartime government diverted food supplies from Bengal to British war stockpiles elsewhere, dismissed Indian requests for relief, and Churchill wrote in private correspondence that the famine was the Indians' own fault for breeding. 2 to 3 million deaths. The official response was impatience dressed up as wartime necessity. Now we return to Patnaik and the 45 trillion, because the method matters as much as the number. Patnaik spent years working through India Council records and trade data across 173 years, from 1765 to 1938. She traced the Council bill mechanism precisely as we described it, quantifying the gap between what India exported and what actually flowed back. The portion of export earnings rerouted to Britain rather than returned to Indian producers. She then applied a realistic rate of interest to those annual transfers, compounded across the period. The compounding is what produces the enormous final figure. Money extracted in 1800 was not simply money lost in that year. It was capital that could have been invested across the following century and a half, generating industries and institutions and wealth in India, and did not, because it was in Britain instead. The figure has been disputed, as all large historical estimates are and should be. Some economists argue the compounding assumptions are too aggressive. Others question specific choices in translating historical currency values. These are legitimate scholarly arguments. But the existence of the drain is not seriously disputed by any economic historian who has examined the data closely. Nauroji identified it in 1876. The mechanisms of the council bills and the home charges confirm it in their bare structural logic. The scholarly argument is about the precise magnitude of the number, not about whether the number is real. And the number matters because of what the development argument actually claims. The development argument says that Britain's presence in India was, on balance, a net positive. That what Britain built exceeded in value what Britain took. Patnaik's research, and the broader body of scholarship supporting it, says this calculation is not remotely close. The railways, built with Indian capital, extracting Indian resources for British industry, served British interests first, and Indian development as an afterthought. The administrative structure, financed by home charges drawn from Indian tax revenue, was designed to run India for Britain's benefit, not India's. Whatever genuine development occurred happened despite the logic of the imperial system, not because of it. India's GDP as a share of global output fell from roughly 25% at the beginning of the colonial period to less than 4% at its end. Life expectancy in India at the time of independence stood at approximately 32 years. Literacy was below 20%. Per capita income had barely moved in real terms across the entire colonial period, while Britain was transformed by an industrial revolution that elevated its own population's living standards beyond recognition. If this was development, it was development that somehow left the country being developed no better off after 2 centuries than it was at the start. There is an irony at the center of this story worth sitting with carefully, the same kind of irony that emerges whenever you look honestly at the economics of empire. Britain's Industrial Revolution, the transformation that made Britain the workshop of the world, the event typically presented as evidence of British ingenuity and enterprise and the natural genius of free markets, was substantially financed by what Britain extracted from India and its other colonial territories. The capital that funded the factories of Manchester and Birmingham, the investment that built the railways of Britain and later of America and Australia, the accumulated surplus that allowed British banks to become the financial center of the world, was not generated entirely by British industry and British trade operating in free competition. It was generated in significant part by the enforced underdevelopment of the societies Britain controlled. India did not fail to develop, because it lacked the capacity, the intelligence, or the resources for development. It failed to develop under British rule because the system governing it was organized, deliberately and with great precision, to prevent it from retaining the fruits of its own productivity. And then, when the evidence of that impoverishment became undeniable, the men who ran the system described the poverty they had helped create as proof of the primitiveness that justified their continued presence. It was a circular logic of remarkable brazenness. We are here because you are poor. You are poor, in significant part, because we are here. None of this erases the actual complexity of 2 centuries of shared history. There were individuals within the British administration who worked honestly and sometimes brilliantly on behalf of Indian interests. There are aspects of the legal and administrative inheritance that Indian leaders after independence chose to retain, judging them useful because institutions can be adapted to new purposes regardless of the conditions of their creation. The history of this encounter is not a simple story with heroes and villains sorted neatly into their correct categories, but complexity is not the same as equivalence. Acknowledging that some British administrators cared deeply about India does not make the council bills disappear. Noting that independent India kept the railway system does not refund the cost India bore to build it. The presence of individual decency within a system of extraction does not change the system's fundamental character. The ledgers do not lie about what went in and what came out. The reason this matters now, more than 70 years after the British left, is not about settling old scores or assigning guilt to people long dead. It is about something more practically useful than that. It is about understanding how the language of development and civilization and progress can be deployed to describe a process that is, at its mechanical core, the opposite of those things. The men who ran the British Raj did not, for the most part, think of themselves as running an extraction machine. They thought of themselves as civilizers, as administrators, as men bringing order to chaos. Many of them believed this with complete sincerity, and the distance between that genuine conviction and what their system actually produced is not a footnote. It is the lesson. Empires rarely announce themselves as extraction machines. They announce themselves as development projects. The civilizing mission, the white man's burden, the modernization initiative. These are different names, across different centuries, for the same thing. The machinery operates the same way regardless of what the men running it believe they are doing. To evaluate it honestly, you do what we have done here today. You follow the money, you open the ledgers, and you ask not what was promised but what actually moved, where it moved from, and where it arrived. $45 trillion. A quarter of the world's economy reduced to 4%. 2 centuries of bones bleaching on the plains and grain being shipped from famine zones and weavers reduced from craftspeople to laborers. And a treasury in Bengal emptied in an afternoon by a man who praised his own restraint. That is not the record of a civilizing mission. It is the record of an extraction. And holding that distinction clearly in the mind is one of the most important pieces of clarity available to anyone who wants to understand honestly how the world arrived at the shape it is in today. If you made it all the way to the end of this one, leave a single ink pen in the comments, so I know who stayed for the whole story. If you believe history deserves to be told straight, with the ledgers open and the mythology stripped back, then subscribe, because that is exactly what we do here, week after week. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.